Oi, oi. Who is ready for the geopolitics of artificial intelligence? I am so impressed. You are all ready. Yes, let's do this before lunch. Okay, so the chair will be John Thornhill in conversation with Evgeny Morozov. I'm going to invite them on stage and they can tell you all about it. Do get your Slido on. We want questions at the end. So if you go to the browser, slido.com, and use the hashtag FutureFest, go to the envisioned stage and ask any questions you fancy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and it's great to be at this amazing event today, and it's even greater to be with Evgeny Morozov. It's wonderful to have a chance to talk with him, who I think is one of the best writers on technology of our age. Evgeny was born in Belarus in 1984, a year obviously freighted with great significance. He later grew up and worked in Germany and the US. He is a brilliant essayist and author, and he has written two very influential books. The Net Delusion in 2011, which challenged the prevailing narrative that the internet was a tool of democracy and liberalism, and To Save Everything, Click Here, published in 2013, which challenged the prevailing narrative that tech had a solution to every problem. We are going to talk today about the geopolitics of AI. We'll talk for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have an opportunity to ask, for you to ask questions from the floor. So, Evgeny, I would like to start with President Vladimir Putin. In September last year, he said this: "Artificial intelligence is the future, not only for Russia, but for all humankind. It comes with colossal opportunities, but also threats that are difficult to predict. Whoever becomes the leader in this sphere will become the ruler of the world." Is he right?
Well, I think to a large extent, yes. I think we can debate, and I'm sure we will on this stage, to what extent the debate around artificial intelligence is full of hype. All of that, I think, is a valid debate. But nonetheless, it seems clear that it becomes the infrastructure around which many other domains, industries, parts of society, whether it's education or health or transportation, will be shaped. And in as much as it remains infrastructure, it's very important to ask who owns it, because if it's owned by states with certain geopolitical imperatives, they will be able to twist it any way they want. So I think there is a realization on the part of, let's say, non-US countries, so aligned states, that the last 2 or 3 decades have been relatively good for extending US power over this infrastructure. It started with the internet, but eventually it spread to collection and ownership of data. Eventually it led to breakthroughs in machine and deep learning. And I think there is a realization that certainly in China, which has been taking a lot of steps to catch up, but also in places like Russia, in India, and Latin America, that if they do not have some alternative to either American or Chinese infrastructure, they'll be forced to play by the rules they do not set. And with Trump, especially now, I think that there is a fear that there is complete unpredictability as to which way the wind might blow in the United States.
I mean, it's interesting that Putin made this comment because Russia is not evidently a superpower in AI, is it? Or you think it is in certain areas?
It clearly has a lot of good researchers, and its university culture is still one of the strongest when it comes to churning out a lot of graduates in engineering and AI. They also have a couple of, for example, assets in this domain that other countries don't have. Through various interventions, they managed to preserve Russian search engines and Russian social networks, and they, to some extent, are the ones generating data, which plays a key role in producing and enhancing deep learning mechanisms. So while it's not a leader in AI, it definitely has some of the ingredients which many other countries are missing. In much of Europe, for example, there is very little control over key passing points, so to say, of this data infrastructure. There is nothing comparable to search engines or social networks or anything else. So again, I wouldn't necessarily bet against Russia in this field. They're not at the level of China, and certainly not at the level of the United States, but they have the human potential and they have some of the key levers through which they can catch up.
Now, you've touched on this, but I would really like to focus on a definition of AI that we can all agree on, because the term is bandied around and people mean very different things by it. What is your understanding of it, and could you just expand a bit more on why you think it will be truly significant?
Sure. Well, I think there is, of course, a much more profound historical, philosophical debate about what intelligence is and how we can formalize it, and whether, conventional logic and formal logic is enough to formalize it, or whether we as humans have a different intelligence which is not formalizable. I mean, that debate has gone on for centuries, since Leibniz probably, and will go on for much longer. I think as far as states and governments are concerned, we're talking about a much weaker definition of artificial intelligence. We're talking essentially about the ability to predict, the ability to classify, the ability to recognize certain objects and differentiate them from one from another. And does it amount to a full-blown equivalent of the human mind? Of course not. Could it result in billions of savings and ways to mechanize and automate things that were previously done by humans? Yes. And this is where I think the geopolitical ramifications arise. So I'm more than happy to stick to the weakest possible definition of what constitutes artificial intelligence. Mm-hmm. So the ability to recognize objects, to recognize that this is a car and this is a traffic light might seem banal, and you can build that capacity with enough photos of cars and traffic lights, but combined with the ability to recognize other objects and understand your location, it already gives you a head start in building a self-driving car, right? So in that sense, I don't think we need to imagine some kind of Terminator-like scenario or Skynet or anything of the kind that a lot of people are worried about on the ethical front. In order to understand the geopolitical ramifications of this will be immense.
Okay. Now, the debate about AI in some respects seems to resemble the early debate about the internet and the World Wide Web. We tended to think it was going to be a fantastic benefit to mankind, it was going to liberate and democratize society. And you were among the first people to warn that this was not necessarily going to be the case. And it seems to me that we're having a bit of the same debate about AI at the moment, that a lot of the proponents of it have pointed to the many wonders that it might be able to deliver, and I think a lot of those are for real, but there are clearly the dark side to this, as you're already alluding to. So how do you think this debate is going to work out? How are we going to get the best of AI and prevent the worst?
Sure. Well, I think, in my own earlier work, and certainly in my book, The Net Delusion, which came out almost, I finished it almost a decade ago, I think there was an implicit assumption, but I never articulated it explicitly, that every debate about the internet and its benefits and virtues is also a debate about the virtues and benefits of capitalism. And particularly this current stage of capitalism with heavy commitment to data, to some kind of cognitive component to it. I mean, essentially, we are talking about the ability of a couple of firms to deliver certain benefits by sticking to certain business models. I mean, to me, this is what the debate about the internet has been, even though much of the media and the public sphere refuse to treat it that way, preferring to treat the internet as a medium of some kind and not just as a byproduct of business models, right? And if you think about artificial intelligence, I think there you would be far better off understanding the points at which there is no overlap between Alibaba, let's say, and Amazon Web Services, if you really want to understand the impact of artificial intelligence on the world. All I'm saying is that having this abstract debate about artificial intelligence and its impact on humanity, it's not going to give us many benefits, because even the activities of those firms are heavily shaped by the internal dynamics of competition in this industry. Just to give you an example, so a decade ago, virtually nobody was offering web services or cloud services, right? Most firms in this field were selling advertising. Google was doing it, Facebook was doing it, Amazon was selling products, right? Once Amazon entered the services sphere and understood that there is a lot of money to be made, a decade later, everybody suddenly is doing services, and they realize that maybe that's the future, because the profit margins of them selling web services are much higher than even selling products. Mm-hmm. So I think similar phenomenon would be observed with regards to AI. So it's not like reading tea leaves and then thinking, what are the permanent feature of artificial intelligence that are going to result in one world to another world. I think it's much more of what the geopolitical and economic and trade environment and the relations between China, US, and European Union will look like in the next decade, and how it will then result in certain products or not. Because if suddenly Europe decides to adopt as they've done, a very strict privacy regulation, it will clearly make it much harder for Europe to catch up and do something about artificial intelligence, right? So, I mean, I think those are the criteria we have to be focusing on, much more than some kind of almost philosophical discussion about what it is about AI that makes it so powerful.
I mean, this also touches on the nature of power in the modern world, doesn't it? Because 7 of the 10 most valuable companies in the world are US and Chinese tech companies, and they are really very much at the leading front of the leading edge of AI research and deployment. Are they going to be like this kind of 7 sisters of our technological age in the way that we thought about the kind of oil companies in the 40s and 70s, or are they even more powerful than that, do you think?
Well, I think there are several ways to interpret this, and I think they partly overlap. So clearly, you can also see and interpret the immense value that they have accumulated in the stock markets as just a sign of stagnation in the other parts of capitalism. That essentially, if you do not count technology firms, the global economy is not really growing, right? And there is very little to be proud of if you basically exclude the technological sector, and especially from the indexes that now people use to understand whether there is growth or not on stock markets. So this is one way to read it, that it does not reflect the internal power, it just reflects the lost hope in the investor class about the ability of capitalism to pull itself out of the crisis. And who can do it? Uber can do it, or Facebook can do it, or Amazon can do it, by introducing immense efficiency into how we organize our economic activity. There is another way to read it, and I think it also has some truth to it, which is that the expectation, for example, behind Amazon's immense value has to do with the expectation that they are going to enter almost every single industry where there is some data and there is some benefit to be had. So now they're entering pharmaceutical business, they're entering insurance business, they will be entering, who knows, banking business, we don't know, right? And now they're no longer a platform. And that, I think, what also makes add some confusion to the debates we are having, because we talk a lot about platform capitalism, we talk a lot about the platform society. But in reality, if you look at Amazon, all the data that they accumulate about the products we sell, it clearly also allows them to be selling their own products, right? So they are a platform, yes, but they are also a competitor and they are a player, just like Alphabet is with self-driving cars, right? Yes, they allow people to advertise on these platforms, but they're also offering a lot of services on their own.
Right. I'd like to just delve a bit deeper into the power of some of these companies that you've been talking about. I mean, there was a debate the other year with Mark Zuckerberg when he was traveling around the 50 states of the US and whether he was going to become president of the United States. And then there was a counter-narrative saying, why on earth would he want to give up power? Facebook has 2 billion odd users. It knows infinitely more about most of those users than the governments know about their own citizens. I've heard a Facebook executive once talking about whether they should be the ones who are issuing passports nowadays because they know far more than they can validate identity far better than any government can do. What do you make of that? Is it wrong to think of geopolitics now as talking about nations or blocks? Should we be thinking more about it as these corporations?
Well, I wouldn't underestimate the power of the state still to be able to intervene and shape this environment. I mean, China actually gives you the most visible and vivid example of how a state-driven strategy could actually produce a competitor to Silicon Valley. So, I mean, yes, we can be clearly negative about the human rights implications of the Great Firewall of China, but in retrospect, it has been a great instrument of trade for them because it essentially kept the foreign companies out of the market, allowed them to build their own domestic tech industry, which clearly serves their political agenda. But nonetheless, it shows you that discounting the state, I think, is not necessarily moving in the right direction. And even in the US, I think if the Congress really wanted to crack down on Facebook, They would, but they do not do it also for geopolitical reasons. And if you had seen the memo that Mark Zuckerberg was carrying to his testimony in Congress, there was a very interesting passage there, which was caught by photographers, which basically stated that America should not crack down on Silicon Valley and Facebook because that will further embolden China, right? So, and I think that's one of the main reasons why I would not expect any action from Washington. It's not because they are powerless, it's because given the current conjuncture, let's say it just pays to them not to do much. It also leaves Europe in a bit of a suspended state because there is little coordination, as I see it, between European industry, European Commission, and national capitals. And this is where I think Europe's inability to move in the right direction resides. But I also would like to highlight on this, while we're on this subject, the importance of also thinking global and transnationally. Because if you look at the main entity that's shaping the present and the future of artificial intelligence now, that would be SoftBank, right? This massive Japanese firm that has amassed this almost $100 billion vision fund, which goes and purchases and buys up the most important companies in robotics and artificial intelligence and transportation and ride sharing and so forth. And if you look at SoftBank, it's not obvious which state it actually represents. In terms of state investment, most of its money, in terms of states, comes actually from Saudi Arabia and the sovereign wealth fund of the Emirates, right? But they also have money from European sources. So Daimler, a company that technically should be afraid of Chinese, and even though Daimler now, their largest shareholder is actually a Chinese company, but nonetheless, a German company invests in SoftBank together with Saudi Arabia, and SoftBank then goes and buys Boston Dynamics, this big robotics firm that everybody has seen. So, I mean, those are the kinds of movements that are very easy to lose if you just focus on the companies and the nation state, and you do not introduce this more global actor in it.
Okay. While we're on nation states, though, I'd like to kind of contrast and compare what's going on in the US and China in terms of AI. These are two very different models of development. In the US, you've got mainly the big corporations who are developing this. It's a very decentralized, uncoordinated approach. In China, you have a very state-led, directed development of AI. Xi Jinping has made it quite clear that he wants Made in China 2025 program to make China at the leading edge of a lot of these important cutting-edge technologies, including AI. And Twitter got very excited the other day when they had a picture of Xi Jinping in his office, and they had a translation of Pedro Domingo's The Master Algorithm on his bookshelf behind him. So there really is a kind of sense that China is putting so many bets on AI. Which of these two models is more likely to prevail, do you think?
Well, again, the question, I think, can be resolved by looking at the broader geopolitical background to negotiations. Essentially, the questions we need to be asking is whether countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and Eastern Europe, for example, are likely to go for American providers of the services of the Chinese. And clearly, you cannot answer that question based on the merits of the respective technologies, because China is doing a lot of work behind the scenes, like America does. But America does this through American Chamber of Commerce, through informal institutions. China does it formally. So, right now, I think in Bulgaria, China is about to host a very big summit, 16+1, with all of the Balkan states and Eastern European states, and give them incentives to do deals with Chinese technology companies and other companies, because they also have a big industrial push, an infrastructure push. And I think that ultimately, America used to do that also. It's not as if before the end of the Cold War, America was completely innocent of any shaping of European or Asian or Latin American markets. America was doing it quite heavily. It's just that I think there was some ideological error made in Washington. And it's quite telling that before he wrote The End of History, Francis Fukuyama was actually a staffer at the State Department. So I think there was an ideological error made, thinking that the model that has been honed out and sort of articulated during the Cold War, whereby America does not really have to invest constantly into maintaining its power in the global sphere, it will continue. And I think that China has proved that that's not going to happen. And what we are seeing now in Trump is an effort to essentially react to that. To what extent one model or the other favors the development of AI, I think without doubt the Chinese model works. It works in that they have more data that they know what to do with. They don't have privacy violations of any kind. So, I mean, we can talk about the democratic benefits of the Chinese model, but it will be a very different discussion from the mere efficiency of their system. In terms of the mere efficiency of the system, they do what I think is right. They provide a lot of monetary incentives. They have announced that they're going to put more than $135 billion into development of AI by 2030, and that's only at the central level, not counting regional and municipal levels. They have allocated to each big company responsibility for a particular sector. So, Alibaba is supposed to take care, I think, of, smart city, and Baidu of autonomous cars. So they have allocated also specific tasks. And they do a lot of industry shaping, which America was doing very heavily during the Cold War.
You mentioned the Cold War. Is it useful to think of the AI arms race? Is it a kind of Cold War scenario that we're facing now? I mean, I was very struck. I was in China last year, and some kind of AI specialists I went to see talked about the AlphaGo becoming the kind of best program was a Sputnik moment for China. It realized that AI was really incredibly serious, and it was a kind of threat to China, and they consequently had to make the efforts that you've been talking about.
Sure.
Is this an arms race?
Well, yes, but again, you have to see it, I think, historically. And, China, over the past 2 decades, I would argue, has been trying to extricate itself from unnecessary dependencies. They have tried to extricate themselves from enormous dependency on the dollar. Did not really work very well, but nonetheless, they identify those kind of dependencies that are not healthy for the extension of Chinese power. And I think they have come to identify artificial intelligence as one of those bottlenecks. And I think other countries have woken up to that as well. To what extent? I mean, clearly it's not, we do not see militaries occupying countries yet to defend the power that they have. But even with the available commercial mechanisms, I think they can do quite a lot. And I think this is where really the focus and the big debate that should be happening, but it's not happening, should be in Europe. Because we clearly see China's efforts to enter and buy up the most important European robotics firms, AI firms, buy up also, all sorts of startups that are working in this space. And I don't think that up until very recently, there has been a recognition that Europe should have a common strategy, should put up some money on the table. So if you look at the strategy that the European Commission released in April, so they released the European Union AI strategy, I think, a decade after they should have done it. And that strategy, if you read the headlines, on paper announces a 20 billion euro push to building AI. In reality, the Commission is reallocating 2 billion of the money that have been dedicated to other programs already, and the remaining 18 billion are supposed to come from the industry. Right? And the question then becomes, why would industry do it? So if a company like Daimler can just go and dump its available capital into SoftBank, what are the incentives for Daimler to give money to the European Commission or to projects steered by it? And there is a lack of coordination at the industry level that you see in other domains, like the domain, for example, of developing batteries for electric cars, where Europe faces the same problem. As individual players, the industry finds it much easier to go and strike deals with the Americans or with the Chinese. But as a collective entity, it's obvious that there is a collective action problem and that they really need to cough up some money and have some strategic push from the top.
I mean, the people who think about this in the kind of European Commission would say, we understand that we're lagging behind the US and China in this area, but we think we are creating an alternative and ultimately more sustainable data infrastructure in Europe. GDPR was just one example of that. We think that if people trust us with their data, that will be more valuable than untrusted data. We will be able to create a new kind of ecosystem, a new, more viable data economy, and an artificial industry off the back of that. Do you buy that, or do you think we're just going to get steamrolled by the US and the Chinese?
I don't buy that, because, I mean, as much as I appreciate Europe's efforts to actually articulate a vision that tries to do something in artificial intelligence while retaining some of the control of the citizens' data. And you can see it in many projects. We just had a session about cities where Barcelona is doing something with the Decode project that's like that. Where you have some privacy, but you also have some public use of the data that's being generated by citizens. Those are valuable projects. But at a higher level, I think the problem is that it's very... European private industry does whatever it wants. So you just had a big deal this week with a very major French transportation and logistics group, Bolero, which struck a deal with Alibaba Cloud. Right? And when you have individual deals within European industry, even European municipalities, which are approached by Amazon, Google, IBM, Microsoft on a daily basis, when you have such bilateral deals, you do not have any coordination, right? So you cannot, of course, you should continue doing big things with data, but you should, and with privacy and GDPR, but you should then also regulate and mandate, in terms of tenders. Can you do business with American or Chinese firms if there are local European alternatives? I mean, those are the kind of questions that Europe really needs to tackle because, unfortunately, European Commission does not have any control over the rest of the European economy, and the European firms can do whatever they want. And unfortunately, they're interested in cutting costs. That's just in the nature of capitalist competition. And if they want to cut costs, they just go to Alibaba.
What does a post-Brexit Britain look like in this world?
Well, I mean, Britain has done better, I think, than its standing suggests in artificial intelligence so far. But it also sold off its crown jewels. DeepMind went to Google. The big chip company went to SoftBank. So essentially, there has not been strategic coordination at the level of retaining some control over the key infrastructure. But we have also seen an announcement of major funding initiative by the British government in relation to artificial intelligence earlier this year. I think ultimately the scale at which these things work right now, you can either stick with Europe or you can forget about being anything other than a customer.
How about the rest of the world? How does it cope in this world of two AI superpowers?
It doesn't. I mean, so what you see are certain strategic state efforts. So, they're not very well covered in the international media. But, for example, China has many bilateral funds. So at the state level with countries like Russia or Belarus or India. Well, India, I don't think they have it, but nonetheless. And they invest jointly into local companies and try to retain ownership of them before, Google moves in. But ultimately, you have to be realistic. I mean, given the scale, given also the capital investment that these companies are pouring into developing and honing AI. I mean, Amazon spends, I think, $15 billion in R&D every year, and Facebook is maybe 13, and Alphabet is somewhere in that range. Alibaba just committed $15 billion to developing just AI for the next 3 years. Those are not trivial sums. You cannot do it as a startup in Brazil or a startup in Bangladesh. I mean, it's going to be very hard because the money involved is huge. So I think we are looking at potential alliance between Russia and China, the US possibly aligning with the UK, and then Europe doing it on its own by, maybe also throwing in Norway, Switzerland, and countries in the area.
All right, one last question before I go to the Slido questions, which is about the military nature of AI. I mean, there's also in the West been this very active debate led by some of the leading AI specialists that they should not be involved in abusing AI for military ends. And we saw this quite demonstrably in the Google example recently on Project Maven, where their own employees stopped Google trying to work with the US military. One presumes that's not an issue in China. Is that going to mean that, therefore, China has a really distinct military edge against the US and others?
Well, theoretically, yes. Practically, I don't think they are just so advanced as the US and parts of Europe in terms of military technology development. I mean, they certainly have been investing a lot trying to catch up. And clearly, the more Europe becomes digital, the more important Chinese equipment makers become. And we've seen it with Huawei, with ZTE. I mean, clearly, given the costs of it, even big European firms like Ericsson can no longer compete with equipment coming from China. So China clearly has an edge in some of these technologies. I don't think, as you've said, ethics is a big problem there. But to be honest, I also don't think that let me put it that way. I think many of these revolts around ethics and big tech firms in the US, they've been symbolic. I don't really make much of them. I mean, Amazon still runs CIA's cloud, and they will continue running it, and I don't expect them dropping that contract anytime soon. And I'm sure that if you look very hard, All it takes is to look at affiliations that Eric Schmidt has with the Defense Advisory Board in the US to understand how deeply Google is implicated in various defense ventures. So, I certainly welcome the fact that the employees are becoming critical and are waking up to the threats. But I would like them to be as critical about the economic elements of Google's and Amazon's dominance and not just about the military ones. And that, to me, is something that's still very much missed. It's very good. It's very easy to be a moral and ethical person. It's much harder to understand why it is that Google and Amazon present a threat to some kind of economic model behind democracy and things like that. And that's the part that's still missing in Silicon Valley, despite the recent wave of ethicists and humanitarians and humane tech camps and groups that have sprung up in Silicon Valley.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, you've certainly given us a lot to think about. Some questions from Slido. This touches on kind of Europe and GDPR, but Europe may fall behind in AI due to data protection laws. How can we balance privacy with the need to keep up with the rest of the world in this area?
Well, that's been the complaint coming from European industry, essentially, that, especially from the German industry, that the heavy privacy regulations in Europe prevent a common response. So I don't think it's entirely inaccurate. I think what's missing are experiments in Europe in articulating different visions for data ownership. Right? And I think GDPR does not get us there. GDPR just draws a separation between personal and personal data. And since personal data is yours, and personal data can circulate widely. What about social data? Right? What about data that I produce in common with the people who live in my neighborhood? Who has ownership over that? Will it be considered private property, in which case you can expect secondary markets emerge in that data, which means that any public sector actor would actually need to pay to get that data? Or will we actually be considering that data produced in common as some kind of a common infrastructure that should belong not to Google and not to me, but to the entity that built the road with taxes, in which I'm walking? And I think Europe has not succeeded, with an exception of a project like the Code, it has not succeeded in actually taking on board this vision of social data ownership, because if you really want to preserve a social economy and social market economy of some kind, which is conscious of its own foundations and of its own conditions of possibility, so to say, you really have to be conscious also of the role that shared resources like data play in sustaining it. You cannot just reduce everything to private property and continue.
Yep. Okay, next question. What about the developing countries? How do we ensure these countries are not left behind as the superpowers advance further on AI? Do they have a role to play?
Well, they certainly do, and they've understood what's coming, and I think they've understood that the best way for them to understand debates about data and artificial intelligence is to link them to debates about industrialization and deindustrialization. So, there have been a couple of papers written in the context of some of the recent discussions in WTO, because WTO, a group of rich countries, are really pushing to extend all of the provisions with regards to the free flow of data and essentially impose any blocks on data localization, which would mean that a big provider like Amazon can come into a country somewhere in Southeast Asia and basically extract all the data that it wants and leave, and then use that data to train its algorithms. And the country from which the data was taken can do nothing. And instead, they have to celebrate it as a big improvement in commerce. And I think that given some of the recent moves in the global debate, following Trump, and there is a realization that something is not right in this rhetoric, right? And so to some extent, I don't necessarily even see the current moment as unhealthy, because it allows us to reopen many of the questions regarding trade, right? And who exactly benefits from free trade, including free trade in data, that have been closed. And they have been deliberately closed, and non-aligned countries and developing world countries have been trying to open them for 40 years, and they have not succeeded.
One country we haven't really talked very much about is India. It
Yes.
really has a vast population, very good technological skills.
Yes.
Are they going to be a player in AI?
Well, India is an interesting case, because in India, the industry has understood a while ago that, and India has quite a robust IT industry and telecommunications industry, and they have understood that if they do not articulate their own national vision for preserving control over technology, they're going to lose out to the Chinese or to the Americans. So India has been trying to build what they call the India stack, which was an effort to essentially control all of the main elements from the cloud to hardware behind the infrastructure used by Indian businesses and the government. I think they made a mistake in linking that to Modi's push for biometric authentication, which created a lot of resistance to the idea of the India stack, which, on the face of it was not bad. Of course, it's all in private hands. So it's not a publicly provided stack, publicly provided infrastructure. So from my political viewpoint, it's not ideal, but it's still better than being in complete dependence on the Chinese or American providers of infrastructure, identity, AI, big data, and so forth.
Okay, one other question on an area we haven't really touched on is whether governments ought to do more to regulate or disrupt these massive data platforms. Where do you line up in the regulatory debate?
Well, let me put it that way. So there are tactical interventions here and strategic ones. Tactically, I'm all for European Commission and Europe doing everything they can to thwart Google, Amazon, and the rest of them. So in that sense, though theoretically, I think it does not make sense to have 20 little providers of services that Google provides now as a centralized player. I think tactically it's a good intervention. But strategically, it's obvious to me that data acquires more value if there is more of it in one place. So my ideal intervention, and I've been advocating it in articles for many, many years now, is to have an approach where data itself becomes socialized. So data does not belong to Google, Amazon, or their local equivalents. Data belongs to us, to citizens, to municipalities, to social players of some kind. And then whoever wants to come and offer services on top of that data is free to do so, with the government being able to regulate the conditions of access. So if I have a competition between my local startups that want to build a mapping service and Google, I can charge Google for access to that data, and local startups will get a grant. Right? So you can actually have this gradual access to data that's held in common by public actors, which would not assume that the only answer to the dilemma we're in is to either approve of Google or to break it up. Right? Because ultimately, I think you have to understand from where so much of the value derives. And I would argue that ultimately, right now, much of their value and power derives from the data, and of course, AI built with it. And if we really want to strike at the heart of that business model and change it, we have to go after data. So a different ownership regime for data, for me, is a prerequisite to solving the problem.
Okay, time for one last question from Slido. And this, I think, gets to the heart of what you were talking about right at the start, that a lot of the debate about technology is not exactly the specific uses of the technology, yes, but the environment in which it operates. And it's the kind of capitalist impulse that drives it in particular directions. So the question is, what would AI look like if it was unbound from the capitalist norms, as it were? What could it deliver if we allowed it to, if that doesn't sound too...
Yeah, no, look, I'm fully on board with actually developing applications with as advanced technology as possible, and actually, using them to build a more humane and more enjoyable version of the services that we have lumped under the heading of the welfare state. So I have no problem, in general, finding a way to offer a better healthcare service, or a better education service, or a better transportation service mediated by technology. The question to me really is whether the savings and the benefits and the profits made with that AI are going to accrue to investors in Saudi Arabia, who has invested so much money into Uber and SoftBank, or whether they're going to accrue to people locally, because it was with their data that these technologies were built. If we manage to create an environment where we can automate everything, but the benefits and the savings and the profits behind that automation accrue to us as citizens who have helped to build it without data, I'm all behind automation. The problem is that given the amounts of money that are being exchanged now, and given the inability to articulate a different vision of data ownership, we'll most likely end up in a world where everything will be offered as a service, but it will be offered from the outside by 2 or 3 dominant providers of the services, with no money even staying in the local economy. Because if you are paying to a taxi driver now when you take a car, and that taxi driver goes and buys a newspaper or buys a coffee in a bar, once you pay to an automated Uber car, that money goes directly to investors and people behind Uber, and since they try to avoid taxation, it does not even stay in the form of taxes in the local economy. And to me, that's the key issue. So we should be able to reorient this debate towards the political economy behind AI, much more so than debating and continuing debating the moral and ethical applications of whether it's good to automate taxes.
I think that's a very good place on which to end. You've raised some really profound insights, some incredibly scary and disturbing questions, but I think we can all rest assured that Nesta is working on the answers. So thank you very much, Evgeny.
Thank you. Sure.
Thank you very much, guys. Thank you.